I'd like to welcome you to this session hosted by ADDI on data sharing. And I'm going to start with just a few slides to introduce ADDI and the reason for our existence. And then we'd like to go to a discussion, a fireside chat type discussion with two individuals who are really leading the efforts in data sharing through the ADDI in our platform, Miia Kivipelto, who you can see on camera now, and Craig Ritchie, who will be joining us shortly. But first, I'm Tetsu Maruyama. I'm the Executive Director of ADDI, and I'll be running through these slides for you quickly before we get to the interesting part of our discussion. And the session really is focusing on the importance of global data sharing. We know this is a European-focused conference, but we also know that, as in all parts of the world, we depend on data from everywhere, and we depend on the ability to share data with everyone in order to address the incredibly difficult problems associated with dementia. So we've identified 5 key focus areas. These actually were initially identified in a 2017 blog by Bill Gates when he announced his entry as an individual who wanted to do more to help achieve goals around the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And everyone who's here will be familiar with each of these areas and the need to improve on them. As a disease, we need a better understanding of Alzheimer's disease and the underlying biology. We need biomarkers both to make clinical trials work better and to provide diagnosis for people with dementia as early and as accurately as possible. We need some of our new understanding about Alzheimer's disease to translate into shots on goal, as we say, new pipelines, new projects by biotech companies and big pharma companies. And we need all of those to be tested more quickly and more efficiently in clinical trials. So Mr. Gates committed to support each of these, particularly the biomarkers, through collaboration with the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation and the Diagnostics Accelerator, the pipeline through the Dementia Discovery Fund, and the Part the Clouds Initiative, collaborating with the Alzheimer's Association, trials through the USC-led initiative with the support of IQVIA. But underlying all of those things is data. We need data for each of those 4 areas above it, and we need we need to be able to share that data amongst more people. Can I have the next slide, please? The problem is, right now there is a lot of data out there in the world. People have been working very hard to collect data that ranges from clinical trials with random controls to longitudinal studies to observational studies. And some of those data are available for people to use, but they tend to exist in islands. There's a set of data here, a set of data there, a set of data somewhere else. If you're a person with a question who wants to analyze data, you may get access to one of those sets, or maybe you will get access to another one. Maybe you won't get any. If you have code that you think is useful for solving a problem, that can only be applied to some sets of data, and similarly for analyses. So this means if you're a user and you want to do broader studies, you have to contact multiple sites and log into multiple platforms. If you want to share the data, it's likely that you have to bring it down onto your computer, so that data sharing means data copying, which can be a compromise to security, because once data are downloaded to users' location, they're lost to monitoring by the original data owner. Users will require their own compute infrastructure, which is fine for established laboratories in the rich world, but doesn't allow participation in low middle income countries, or from maybe researchers who are just starting out and don't have those resources. And ultimately, it encourages the kind of siloed research that isn't going to move us forward as quickly as we want to go. So in order to address this underlying data issue, the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative was created. And if we see the next slide, please. Originally, this was created as a coalition of interested partners. And in this sort of soup alphabetical order soup, you can see, for example, the Critical Path for Alzheimer's Disease, Dementia Platforms UK, and the GAIN, the Alzheimer's Association's interactive network, 3 existing data sharing platforms for Alzheimer's disease, and a number of other organizations that are either sponsoring those platforms or else philanthropic undertakings that want to advance the cause of Alzheimer's disease. And all of these in the coalition, for a pilot phase that lasted a year, were addressing the question, is this feasible? Can data be made interoperable with using existing platforms? Can we increase the sharing of dementia-related data that's coming from varied sources, some from academic groups, some from industry, some from government sources, many from a combination of those? And can we empower scientists to find, search, combine, analyze those data sets? So those 3 things: can we get more data to play more nicely together? Can we increase the amount of data that's available to play with? And can we get more people to bring more ideas to those data? So what's different? Hi, Craig, welcome. We're going to run through a few slides and then I'm going to call on you. So what's different from that situation now, and what's different in our vision for the future is basically the ability to integrate all these data more easily, existing data that is in the process of being collected now, data from all over the world representing people of all different types. So ADDI has been set up initially, and now it just celebrated our 1-year anniversary as a standalone nonprofit organization, created as a global platform to bring diversity of data sets, diversity of users, diversity of studies, to break down those silos so that it's easier to gain more information from the data that exists out there, to create collaborative workspaces where people can work together, whether it's within your own lab, within your own institution, or halfway across the world, with optimized security and data provenance and access to both the sharing platforms and the tools and resources. If you're not a data scientist, but you want to ask questions of these data, we want to make it easy for you to do that. If you are a data scientist and you're maybe not so up to date right now on Alzheimer's disease, we want to create a community that can help you apply your skills to these problems. So we said we wanted to build a community, and we're in the process of doing so. We now have over 2,000 users from 80 countries, including 510 users that come from, I guess we've grouped together the UK and other European countries. We'll have a debate perhaps some other time about whether the UK counts as a European country or not. Craig may wish to weigh in on that. The people that are using our workbench in order to analyze data come from a number of different backgrounds. Obviously, as we'd expect, we see people who are data scientists and bioinformaticians. We see neuroscientists working in academia and in the pharmaceutical industry. We see clinicians, and thankfully, we see people with dementia and their families and their caregivers who also want to use data to understand this disease that looms so large in their lives and the lives of their loved ones. And this is something we actively wish to encourage. Again, this being the Alzheimer's Europe, we circled Europe. You probably knew where it was, but just to focus in on that a little bit and say the data sets that we have now and the data sets that we have coming on board are going to come from many parts of the world where we want to see greater participation in both Alzheimer's research and studies and also in formulating new ideas and hypotheses about it. We do have really a significant number of subjects from Europe, and for that we have Miia and Craig to thank, and we'll bring them in to give their side of the story in a moment. But again, we're also aware of the fact that we have some very large gaps in our map here. We have nothing in Africa and much of Western and Central Asia. And we are working through our collaborators to see how many more people from how many more countries we can bring on board. I'm not going to go into this slide in detail, but just to let you see, we do have a significant number of trials now added through our collaboration with Vivli, who is a great source of industry-based clinical trial data in a range of therapeutic areas, but we are now working closely with them to bring interoperability onto our AD workbench organization through them. So there are large phase 3 trials. We have a selection of phase 2 trials, earlier trials. Eli Lilly very generously provided all the data from their JERA studies, that's US, EU, and Japan, and additional data sets are coming on board quickly. I will just quickly point out, for right now, in terms of the industry-sponsored trials, we seem to have a concentration on target areas that are perhaps not as actively pursued by industry right now. PPAR gamma agonists through trials sponsored by GSK and Takeda, the BACE inhibitors from Lilly, and coming on board soon, we hope, from AstraZeneca and Novartis. There is less in this area here around immunotherapies, and obviously that's because many of them are still being trialed right now, and in the future we hope to be able to bring those trials in, but we recognize there's a limitation on pharmaceutical companies' ability to share data while there's still trials in progress. Okay, yay, we're done with this component. So I hope that that was a helpful introduction, but if we can close the slides and please bring Miia and Craig to the fore. What I really want to do is chat with a couple of the individuals who are really making this happen. It's great for us to talk about sharing data. It's great for us to ask people if they're going to share data. But these are two individuals who are heading large and very effective collaborative groups of people in bringing those data to life. And so I'll ask each of you in turn to just give a brief description of the projects that you're working on, and then I'll have a question for each of you as well. Miia, perhaps we can start with you and just generally tell us a little bit about Fingers, and also about how Fingers became Worldwide Fingers, or is in the process of becoming Worldwide Fingers.
Thank you, Tetsu. And first, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here today. Indeed, there have been a lot of exciting things and progress in the field of risk reduction and prevention. And as I normally say, I think prevention is the treatment we are having today for Alzheimer's disease. It's easier to prevent than repair the damage. And I think there is always something we can prevent and reduce the risk. And luckily, there is a great prevention potential. 40% of dementia is related to modifiable risk factors. And that was what we highlighted in the Finger model, targeting barriers or several risk factors and mechanisms at the same time, the multi-domain intervention. So that Finger model has been getting great interest, and we launched the Worldwide Fingers 2017 to support different countries to test, optimize, and adopt the Finger model in different cultures and in different settings. So clearly, one size does not fit all. We need to fit the intervention to the community to make it really sustainable. And I'm very happy that today we are having 40 countries on board. From all continents, including these several less represented countries, low middle income countries, even African countries are now there. So that I think is really, really great, because we know that the number of dementia cases are increasing so rapidly in these countries. So the pandemic has not been stopping this expansion. I would say it's the opposite. And in a way, we have been able to connect because we can use these digital tools. So that's really great. And I'm, of course, very happy for this support and collaboration with ADDI for the data harmonization and data sharing effort for the worldwide fingers. I think that's the key. We have a unique opportunity to try to prospectively harmonize the data so that we have good quality data to share and really have a global solutions. What is the best method to really prevent and reduce the risk of dementia? So this is the big picture where we are with the worldwide fingers, and maybe two concepts which we can come back to later. We aim to update the finger to Finger 2.0, that it's not only adopted on the societal level, but also on the individual level, taking into account differences in the risk factor profiles. And in that model, we can combine the more personalized intervention with possible drugs. So it's not lifestyle or drugs, but it can be the combination. And these are the models we are developing now and starting soon, the combination therapies, giving the right treatment to the right persons at the right time, going from the complexity to the precision prevention. And the final, just one sentence, what is part of the worldwide fingers is the concept e-fingers, because we need to use more the digital tools. So I believe that if we find a nice hybrid models, we could again develop sustainable interventions. So many of the 40 worldwide fingers countries are using a lot of digital technologies and e-health solutions to monitor and do this type of interventions. So yeah, a lot of exciting things going on and a lot of exciting data to be shared to get really new results and support the implementation as well.
Fantastic, Miia. I've got some questions I'll come back to you on, but first I'd like to hear from Craig. And again, Craig, please tell, it's inconceivable that anyone in the audience does not know what EPAD is, but just in case, a little bit of an overview of EPAD and then kind of a question to work into that. Did you conceive of EPAD as a vehicle for data sharing from the start, or is that something you thought about as you started collecting data?
So no, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the Alzheimer Europe Congress, we've had an EPAD slot really since the project started 5-6 years ago. EPAD stands for the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia program. And it was designed really to establish a trial-ready cohort to then be able to do more rapid phase 2 adaptive clinical trials. That readiness cohort, and Miia was one of the co-authors in the protocol for the actual cohort study, yielded well over 2,000 research participants, very, very deeply phenotyped with very detailed neuroimaging, spinal fluid in everybody, blood testing, lifestyle, risk factor analysis, etc. And I'm also involved, I'm the PI of another project called Prevent Dementia, which is a UK and Ireland based project, a slightly younger age group, 40 to 59-year-olds, several hundred people in that project too. And we're, as you know, we're looking forward to being able to incorporate that data set onto the ADDI platform in a few short weeks. But to your specific question, I think the answer is yes, we did. I mean, when we set up this project with EPAD several years ago, we had something called the Data Oversight Committee, which was a very involved group of individuals, data scientists, technical people, etc. And we designed every element of the data capture system to be instantly ready for data sharing. It is in the IMI mandate, the European Union IMI mandate for data sharing, but we didn't want to sort of collect these data and then as an afterthought think, oh great, we've got all these data, how do we share them? It was baked into the whole design of our data capture, curation, quality control, and ultimately sharing onto the ADDI platform. So not only was that because it was almost a legal requirement within the project agreement, I think it was fair to say that with all my colleagues, my co-PIs, and indeed with the research participants, this was our philosophy and our expectation that we want to yield the most knowledge out of the data we were collecting, and felt that the only way to do that was through open data access.
Fantastic, and a great point that you've made as well, Craig, that there is a mandate to share data, and then there's a reason for sharing data.
Yeah.
And if I may make a contentious analogy, in some places there's a mandate for mask wearing these days, and then in other places there's an agreement and an understanding that wearing masks is an important thing to do. And it may be that there is a qualitative difference ultimately in how effective that is on the basis of how genuinely committed people are to doing the sharing versus the, oh, I better tick that box because the funder says so.
Yeah, and I think another analogy is just as you were talking there, I didn't feel, and I'm not sure any of the leadership group felt within EPAD, that we were pushing a rock up a hill. I felt that we were pushing a rock down a hill in terms of data sharing, because it really was within everybody's interest and everyone's heart really to use the data or to exploit the data in many ways as best we could globally. So yeah, I think it was just a matter of getting it done well, not whether or not we should do it.
Mm-hmm. If I may comment here, Craig, we work together in the EPAD, and I think the same kind of atmosphere has been following when we have been then developing the worldwide fingers. Is more the mindset and the kind of creating that mindset that data sharing is part of that, and then it's more how to do it and why you are doing it. So I agree that is the way how it's, and we have been working a lot in worldwide fingers also creating that kind of mindset to start with. Is part of the network that should be there, and I think people understand it because especially on the trial setting as well, it's not only data sharing, but you can really share the lessons and experiences when you have that. We don't want to repeat the same mistakes when we are starting new trials. We should more quicker way get the experiences and data and share them with others.
So that addresses a little bit one of the questions I was going to ask me, and I'll come back to it. But I do want to take the opportunity to ask the both of you. I think if you surveyed anyone in this community and said, is data sharing a good thing? Everyone would say, well, of course, data sharing is a good thing. Data sharing leads to other things. And yet we're not sharing that much data. So what do you find is the most challenging part of data sharing, of getting your data to a broad range of people? Miia.
Well, if I start with that, if data sharing is good, I agree. Many researchers, we are saying, yes, it's a good thing, but I would go back to that, and we need, of course, to think also why we are sharing data. For me, it's more the mean, what we are doing. You need to have the purpose of doing that. And again, I also want to highlight the quality, the data quality. If we share data, we should know what data we are sharing. And that's again one thing what we wanted to highlight in the worldwide fingers. We want to use the data harmonization so that we can try to increase the quality of the data and we have more kind of similar data elements. I think that has not always been happening in the trials. So again, that's why we have been really putting a lot of effort worldwide trying to do that. Otherwise, what are the challenges? Of course, we all know the regulatory issues, especially given that now we are having the European landscape, the GDPR, and how that is interpreted in different countries. I would think what we have also learned that there is a lot of differences just between European countries if you ask from different institutes. So our experience from worldwide fingers is that it is time consuming. You need to have that mindset that it takes some time, but by scoping the landscape is possible to do that. So that's what we do now in the worldwide fingers, is that we have started with Finland and Sweden where we have the data available, and we use that example, the practical example, and go to other countries and ask what is needed. What are the requirements? Do you need support? So it's kind of breaking down the big data sharing question to smaller pieces and trying to understand what are the kind of the limitations, and they may be different in different countries. It may be everything from the informed consent, or who is the data controller, what that lawyer or the institute is saying. So it can be quite different in different studies and in different institutes.
Craig, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything Miia just said there. And I think for me, maybe, you know, just to emphasize a couple of points there, that I think one thing that may be a barrier or create some degree of resistance is that, if you like, almost the shareability of the data. And Miia mentioned some things like, for instance, the consent needs to be in place at the outset. But I also, and there's also the information governance systems and, you know, having the DTAs, data transfer agreements and all that sort of thing in place. But I do also wonder, I mean, I did a piece of work for Dementia's Platform UK several years ago, work package one. And this was to look at all the different cohorts within the UK that was going to put data onto the platform. And one of the things which I think we noticed, and this wasn't, you know, I would never name and shame anybody here, because that's the whole point of this, is that some people's protocol, some people's data curation, some people's quality control checks maybe aren't, if you like, industry standard. But that shouldn't be an impediment to them being willing and able to share their data. I think we were very lucky in EPAD, as Miia is with Fingers, to have quite substantial resources to make the data very high quality. And that's not often true of, you know, more academic studies. So I think, you know, people should be willing to share data and share maybe some of the challenges they've had in collecting it. But I think the other thing is that there's also a human element in this, whereby I think PIs, you know, principal investigators of projects, may feel that sharing data may somehow compromise their own academic output. And, you know, me and I are both PIs, and we've published numerous papers from our various projects. But it may be the case that our employers and the universities don't necessarily value data sharing the same way that they would value our academic publications. So there can be these kind of inherent, you know, impediments to sharing data at an institutional level that may not necessarily apply at an individual level. So I think there needs to be a way to create, for the academic institutions who often own these data sets, some way of valuing sharing rather than just valuing the academic output.
Yeah. If I may add to this, Craig, this is especially, we have been discussing this a lot in the randomized controlled trials, like in Worldwide Fingers, because of course the PIs should be able to publish the primary outcome or whatever is there. And I still believe it's possible if you plan that in a good way, that there is respect for the primary analysis, but then there is the second layer, what can be done jointly. And clearly when you have some examples, what you never can do in one trial, even if we have big samples, like gene environmental interactions, is the intervention effect bigger or smaller if you have ApoE or polygenic risk score? This kind of data, I think, gets really interesting when you have the global data. That kind of opens the eyes that why this is so, even simple questions like sex differences, we are often limited by the small sample in one study. So I think they are two different layers, and putting it in that way may help to really understand.
No, absolutely.
So there's a great discussion. Let me pick up on a couple of points that you both made. Craig, your point about sort of institutional incentives, and that works for industry, I think, as well as it works for academia. And what we have found sometimes is when we go to pharma companies and ask them about sharing data, again, they're all open to the idea of it, but the people who are kind of the data owners or controllers tend to be the people who've run the clinical trials, and they maybe don't see themselves as users of the data that comes out. The users are in different parts of their institution. They're doing the drug discovery or the translational side of it. And so we're trying to find a way to align those two sets of incentives. In academia, of course, it's a different sort of thing, but you're right. You know, the institution, some universities may say your publications, you know, as sole author or, you know, within the university are what we want to see. Some of them may want to exploit the intellectual property that comes from what you're using. But those are big, heavy, inert organizations. What do we do to change their minds? How do we sell the idea of data sharing to them, especially when they're saying, yeah, we're in favor of it, but it's all the kind of institutional bureaucratic barriers that make it difficult to actually follow through? If I may.
I wish I had an answer to that. I think you're right. Sometimes those institutional barriers are not necessarily purposeful or designed to impede you sharing data, but certainly within, I think most UK universities, I'm sure it's true of most universities globally, the people who will help you develop these things, the lawyers, the R&D departments, in some ways they're on their knees, with workload, and to do something like this might not necessarily get to the top of their priority list. So I think it's not necessarily they don't want to, it's because they just have so much else going on, particularly over the last couple of years. So it may come down to resources, it might come down to finding ways to help support those activities. But yeah, I don't think there is an easy solution to that. I mean, there is another sort of, at a macro level within the UK, of course, we've got something called the REF, the Research Exercise Framework. And, we've learned over the last 2 years, I think, for all the wrong reasons in many ways, how wonderful it is to collaborate academically to try and find better solutions to COVID, to treatment, to, understanding vaccine efficacy. None of these things can be done by a single academic institution. So I think there needs to be a kind of a lessons learned from the COVID experience, that universities working together achieve so much more than they do independently. But the Research Exercise Framework as a tool for funding universities maybe needs to have some element within it which values collaboration.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
And when I participated in that, I felt the same thing.
Yeah.
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 I fully agree what you said, Craig, and this is the situation. I'm thinking many universities and institutes, like normally if you are the first author or the last author, you get certain point when you get the fundings, and then if you are the middle name, it's not as good. And again, in the big publications, that should not be the main thing always. In some cases, yes, you can be the PI, but in the so I think there should be some kind of change in the attitude that you need to have the big data, you need to have the networks and these kind of things to get new results out of there. And I think that's the thing, it's time consuming. It's easier to have your own data set and do your own, you get maybe faster, more publications. It's also easier for the IT persons and the lawyers because you only handle with the own institute. And I think we need jointly to highlight that this is the future. Like you said, the COVID example, we need to work together, we need to use the data. So I think joint forces are needed there to change that attitude and these actions which are there, I think, limiting us.
So I'm going to ask the two of you to look into your crystal balls and see the future, and speculate on what might be the use cases, what might be the exemplars that would come out of data sharing that would convince the community, whether it's institutions, whether it's people who own data, whatever it is, that we're just going to get further by sharing these data than we're going to by each working on our own data sets. Are there a specific set of issues? I mean, Miia, your effort to bring fingers worldwide isn't just because you want to be able to say you're in 40 or 60 different countries. You had a reason for wanting to do that.
Yeah, and I really believe we use the worldwide fingers as an example, first, if we think the global example, we need to, Dementia is a global challenge. We need to find global solutions. So we can't do it in isolation. So that kind of joint effort is needed. And that's also supporting the countries who have not been part of clinical trials earlier. And here the data harmonization and sharing is so important. Some countries need also help and support just in the data collection and data management. Is not only data sharing, and that's part of our work. What I really believe that we will learn a lot having more diverse data from different populations. So this is one. I mentioned this Finger 2.0, and I think that's the direction where we are moving, more personalized medicine. If we can use all the biomarker data from genetics for biomarkers for clinical outcomes, which is harmonized, I think we can learn so much to really tailor the interventions, both on societal level, but also on individual level. So I in a way think that this is the direction. One more thing is also the new analysis we can do, of course, using machine learning, AI, and data-driven analysis with all this data. I'm talking also about AI fingers, which is now part of our analytical plan. So for that, you need to have the joint analysis. So I'm optimistic with all the good quality data that is there, covering the whole spectrum from at risk for early Alzheimer patients. We can do a lot globally.
Fantastic answer, Craig.
I think
All that.
yeah, well, I'm going to go maybe not completely off piece, but to look into the crystal ball, I think we also have to be aware of the past, and I feel like we are around a fireside chat. There's nobody listening in here, so if this sounds completely crazy, please tell me. But I think,
and that reminds me, by the way, before you get to that, there is the Q&A chat open. So if anyone who is online would like to ask questions, particularly of the experts, Craig and Miia, please do.
Yeah.
In that context.
So we often talk about how, preventing Alzheimer's, and I completely agree with Miia. I think prevention is obviously, better than cure. We often compare this to, we use analogies like, putting a man on the moon or the moonshot and all these sorts of things. And I think we forget, or maybe we don't forget, that to put a man on the moon needed the establishment of an organization called NASA. There isn't a NASA for Alzheimer's disease. What we have is a range of literally probably thousands, if not tens of thousands, of academic activities which are discoordinated. And I think articulating what the key question is, what is the moonshot? What does it look like? What is the thing that we're trying to achieve? You need to build an infrastructure or a leadership or a group together to actually drive that forward. And for that group, which will be a global organization in many ways, the data sharing is one of their assets that they would use to help achieve that aim. Now, as a spin-off from that, as a second strata below that NASA, if you like, for Alzheimer's disease, thousands upon thousands of early career researchers and other academic groups would benefit. But there would be a core that would be looking at, early detection, what those models look like. Miia mentioned artificial intelligence using decision support tools in clinical practice. But there isn't that central coordination of that key research question. I wondered if maybe DAC is getting towards that. It would be great if it was, the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. So I think looking into the crystal ball, I think the field desperately needs, I think, rather than organically creeping towards it in a slow incremental way, we need to maybe have the NASA for Alzheimer's disease, and that kind of, in some ways, command and control structure that allows you to really use the data as an asset amongst the biosamples, the clinical healthcare systems, etc. So a couple of strata there. Number one strata for data sharing is to have an asset for NASA. Number two is the same data, the same environment will be hugely beneficial to early career researchers and people wanting to do maybe more blue sky initiatives.
And I think that's a really fascinating point, Craig, is to say, one of the things that maybe inhibits people putting wild ideas out there is, the resources that are required for any idea, whether it's a conservative idea or a wild idea, and the risk that, if your wild idea misses by a lot, you put your reputation on the line to doing that. Your reputation should be enhanced by trying that, but that's not necessarily the way it works. So in fact, having this central structure, having access to all these data where people can test crazy ideas on the same data, where they can present them to a community, and then, physics kind of does this. If the measurement of your weight of the muon is wrong, the whole community has access to the data, and they can say, well, wait a minute, there's a hypothesis that needs to be tested here, and anybody with the computer and the math skills can test that hypothesis. And if we're in the same position, we can maybe start pushing more, I was going to say the word outlandish, but that isn't really it, but more innovative, more differentiated, more exciting hypotheses out there, because the testing of them is possible by lots of people and the comparison. And so in a way, the sort of access to data is a way of bringing not just people into the field, it's a way of bringing ideas into the field.
And I'm sure Miia wants to come in on this as well, but last week we had our Prevent Dementia General Assembly, so 50 researchers, we all met in Edinburgh. And one of the things that we talked about a lot was trying to overcome confirmatory bias. I think there is a very strong tendency within our field to try and confirm what we think we know about these diseases already. And particularly, you know, as Miia knows, with EPAD data, Prevent data, finger data, we have, you know, non-demented individuals in our cohorts. And some of the data we're seeing and some of the analysis that are coming out around ApoE and gender and sex are not at all what we expected. It seems like ApoE seems to be protective up until about the age of 50.
Sure.
There are massive sex differences in terms of disease process. So
and ethnicity differences as well. I mean, the relationship between ApoE and AD onset,
exactly,
African populations and European populations, we know it's different, but we haven't begun to explore what that means.
I'm sorry, I'll stop in a minute, Miia, but I just to finish, I kind of made the analogy because you mentioned physics, that in some ways we're where physics were 100 years ago, when, you know, classic Newtonian physics didn't understand subatomic couldn't explain subatomic particles. So what do? We created quantum physics, and I think there is probably a need to completely shift the paradigm around these models to younger populations that are completely at odds with everything that we've learned in people with dementia who are older. So we have to be willing to accept that. And that outlandish, you know, Einstein was outlandish in the 1910s.
Quantum physics was outlandish to Einstein as well. So
he thought it was super weird. Yeah, exactly.
So when we create the NASA equivalent for our moonshot, we'll have to put the word quantum in there somewhere.
Yeah, quantum Alzheimer's. Yeah.
I believe that the new Einstein is the person who is sharing the data. Someone has said that, so I think it fits very well. And I fully agree. Thinking the complexity of Alzheimer's disease, we need to think much broader where we are now. And I think we are a bit limited by the structure and the way of thinking the research society has been doing. So I like the idea that taking it much broader and seeing also the whole life course, like where are we? Is it 20 years before the symptoms? Is it when you are there? What are the ethnicity, men and women, different things? So I think that's absolutely the direction where we should go. Really like it.
Fantastic. So, you know, for ADDI, as a person myself who's worked in and around this field for a number of years, I kind of have my own pet ideas that I would like to test. But ADDI, we want to be neutral in this regard, and that's, you know, an important part of our founding is that we are not here to prove or disprove any hypotheses. We are not here to bring any particular piece of data. We're here to allow, I know it's an overused phrase already, but the democratization of these data so that people have access to them. And you know, our hope is that people will be coming in from physics to ask these problems. People will be coming from cancer biology. You know, one of the reasons I think that cancer biology took off to the extent that it did is not just because of the severity of cancer and the obvious need to do something about it, but because it was clear that it was based on cell biology. So if you were a cell or developmental biologist, you could take what you learned and apply that to cancer. And in a way, we haven't had that equivalent in Alzheimer's disease. And so how do we attract those people in? Well, tell them there's data in here. You can find that link. What is it, you know, that you can bring from cell biology to tell us about the biology of brain cells in Alzheimer's disease? So there's an element of faith in the sense of, you know, if we build this, you know, great ideas will come from it. But, you know, I think it's worth doing that. You both mentioned resources at one point or another in the discussion today. You know, obviously you could give a whole list of resources that would be important for doing this. What do you see as some of the key things that either researchers or data contributors would need in terms of resources that they're not likely to have? And how could we help fill those gaps? I mean, Miia, you know, you've mentioned harmonization several times, and maybe if you could just sort of briefly describe to people who may not be familiar with this what you mean by that?
So yeah, and there are surely different needs depending where you are working, what it comes to the support needed. In the worldwide fingers, we have now created harmonization guidelines, which means we want to give support for all new countries and team who wants to start multi-domain interventions. What are the lessons learned? What is the framework? And that's everything from the intervention. What are the intervention domains, the 5 fingers? What do we mean with the physical exercise or cognitive training? And what is the basics? What is the target population? What it could be, how it has been in the other fingers? And importantly, the outcome measures. Of course, we want to do the joint analysis for the cognitive outcomes. So we have been mapping what are the cognitive domains and what is the minimum data element we want to have. This is especially challenging in low middle income countries, what data can be collected, but I still believe that we can harmonize it. We can have, as I said, the basic data elements which are common. And again, it's not only clinical data. We also want to harmonize all kind of biomarkers. So it's a biorepository, everything from collecting the storage and so on for the biomarkers. So I think there's a huge need for many countries having the guidelines and kind of hands-on support. And as I already mentioned, that's also the data collection. It's quite heavy lift in some countries to get the good data there. So this is an area where we are working now quite a lot, trying to support various countries with that. Some countries have been using, for example, REDCap. Some countries are still doing it manually. So trying to map what are the needs. They can be very, very different in different countries. And we have been using quite a lot of time, giving really individual hands-on support, seeing what is needed. And I think that kind of effort is probably needed. You can have guidelines, but then you need to take one more step and see what this country and team is really needing to take the next step.
So some of the resources that people may need are simply guidance and understanding about how to collect data that can be shared.
Yeah, that's maybe the most common question, everything from samples, and that's where we have a lot. And here again, I think the coordination more globally, there should be I hope there will be more shared kind of guidelines for different, and that's maybe something we could do more jointly with ADDI support, trying to harmonize different networks that, for example, the data collection prospectively, we are thinking in the same way.
Absolutely. Craig?
Yeah, I think, again, agree with everything that Miia said. And I think one of the other players we haven't talked about in this is the funding organizations. You know, we talked about IMI, and IMI, to their credit, gave us a substantial amount of resource for our data management within the EPAD grant. But that's actually unusual. I mean, most funding organizations will, commit you to sharing data, but not necessarily give you the resources to be able to do it effectively. And I think, Medical Research Council, Wellcome Trust, AR UK, Alzheimer's Society here, should probably be encouraged to make sure that it is within their funding stream. There's money carved out for the data, the technical data sharing capabilities. And I think one of the other things I would sort of just a couple of other things, Miia touched on this. I think, data, you mentioned about, cancer biologists, you need samples. You need to have access to the biosamples that have also been collected during the course of these cohort studies. And I know that we're obviously very actively working on that with ADDI from an EPAD perspective. But I don't think you can underestimate the complexities of sharing samples and also sharing imaging data. And again, that's something which maybe you don't quite recognize how resource intensive that is as you're going in, and then work out how to do it on the other side. The final thing I'll say though, and this is, I think we talk a lot about cohort data. And I know that, Mia's got a clinic in the Karolinska, and we're developing clinics here in Scotland, brain health clinics, where some of the quality of the data captured in the clinical services is going to be as good as any cohort. I think we need to, and that is truly real world data. Yes. That's everyone coming through the door. So I think we need to encourage the ability of the National Health Service and others to make those data available onto platforms like ADDI to complement the cohort data, which for all the best intentions in the world, cohort data is always going to be biased. So I think, you know, if there's mechanisms to get real world data onto these platforms too, that'll be really transformative.
And do you see this as a growing trend, Craig, that people who are doing the longitudinal work are also running clinics? Because otherwise, I guess, I mean, I can easily see the value of those data, but how do you get the data from the clinic to
I think people are. I think the challenge is, and Miia will want to talk about this as well, is that it's often the PIs of the cohort studies who run the clinic. So you end up with the same biases because you know the clinics are run in Edinburgh or Amsterdam or the Karolinska. What we need to do is find a way to get out of our ivory tower clinics and into the real world to collect the data that's in Miia and, you know, Lund and all these other places. So that's the only two cities I can immediately think of in Sweden, but which are big academic centers as well. So apologies to anybody from Lund and Miia, but Inverness and Stranraer and Berwick. So there you go. But yeah, it's a challenge, but I think it's something again that we need to be able to do. Otherwise, we're always going to have a very big translational gap. In what we do in the scientific world to what we can actually do in clinical practice.
Yeah. And, you know, in Nordic countries, we have the possibility to do a lot of linkage to different registers and health data. We could use that even more, but the access to the health data that is available, having a wider population, not only our selected academic settings. So absolutely, I think is the next step as well. Fully agree.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Mindful of the fact that it's been a very long and I'm sure very exciting and productive day for many of you, and we're down to our last 5 minutes here. Can I just ask each of you, maybe Craig first and then Miia, just if you have any final words for the brave folks who've been following us all along about data sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about data sharing, we've talked about technical platforms, we've talked about, you know, samples and biorepositories and what have you. But at the end of the day, we're people working with people. And I don't think we can ever underestimate the value of human contact. And Miia will know this from Fingers, and she'll definitely know it from EPAD because we work together. The community is really important. We've got to trust each other. You know, data sharing at the end of the day is an articulation of trust between researchers and the platform. So let's not throw out the human baby with the technical bathwater.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say two things. Well, I agree that is the mindset. We work together is the most important. And I also feel and believe that the technical part always is important, but the hybrid model, whatever we are doing, is the techniques and the instruments and platforms for data sharing, but the human touch and that we work together, it's the mindset, is our brains is so important. So joint collaborations, coordinated efforts, I think is needed. The second one, I also hope that it's not only data. We already have a lot of data which we are not using and implementing. So that I think is something we could take, that let's try to use the infrastructure also to implement the data, what is available, increasing the awareness about what is already there. So that could be also some take home what we all can do.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank the both of you for your incredibly active participation, for your insights, the audience for sticking with us the whole time, Alzheimer's Europe for giving us the opportunity to run this, and the unsung heroes in the IT team who brought this through without a hitch at the end of their day. So thanks again to everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your meeting.